Now that I've finished looking over the car, I've got my list of items that I need to order. So I've got my parts for parts list on the engine and transmission. I'm just going to treat this like a major service. So I've got the last of my underbody trays out. I had to lift the back of the car to get the last tray out. So all I'm going to do now is start getting all of my fluids out of the car. I'm going to start draining with my engine oil, get my filter out, get it washed out, get my coolant draining, transmission draining. I got to pull this last tray off to get my transmission to my drain points there. But let's just get all the fluids out. I have to cut the washer off. It's all been over tightened and squished in there. Pretty black. Can't see through it. Definitely time for it to come out. While I got the oil draining, I'm going to use my little special tool that fits up onto the bottom of the oil canister. And this just locks on the little flats right here. If you use a set of channel locks or something like that, there's a good chance that you can damage that, so you always want to use this tool. And I'll get the filter off, get the canister washed out at the same time the oil's draining. Their old filter. Now I'm just going to go wash out our filter housing. I have my new filter. I've got my container. I've washed it out, cleaned it out. Sometimes, I mean, this car's been sitting a long time. There was a little bit of sludge down here. So I've washed it out, got everything cleaned. The other thing I want to do is right here is an O-ring. And I just wind that out like that. This one has been really flattened out. So the filter kit comes with a new O-ring. You always want to change that. I'm just going to clean that groove, get the last of the old oil out of there. And I'll use a little bit of my brake clean to do that. So we had a question from a viewer about the brake clean that we use and about how it can be corrosive or really harsh chemicals. And he was somewhat correct. The cleaners we use are either the MPS 100, which is a multi-purpose solvent, or we use the Worth multi-purpose solvent. Both of these were renamed to this multi-purpose solvent because brake clean was deemed a dirty word by a lot of states, particularly California, about 15 years ago. So one of the things about brake clean, if you go to your local auto parts store, if you pick up the can, a lot of them are going to be chlorinated. This is a non-chlorinated. This one is a heptane and alcohol formula, which means it evaporates really, really quickly. When I spray it on something and blow on it, you'll see the center of it just evaporates away very quickly. This type of cleaner is very safe to use on plastics. We use it on paint and body. I've even cleaned a little grease or oil drips out of interior carpets without it destroying or making the color run out of it. Now, a lot of the brake cleans that you buy over the counter today at the auto parts store will have acetone in them. I find A, they don't clean very well to begin with because they've taken all the stuff out of them that really works. B, if you get it on the vehicle's paint, if you get it on rubbers, it will attack it and can damage it. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're cleaning parts. Make sure that you're using the right kind of cleaners. So I just want to work my new O-ring in, just like that. Then, as always, we're going to slide our filter in, just press it down until it locks in, it'll sit. Don't want to just screw it up in there with the O-ring being dry, so two things you can lubricate it with. You can lubricate the O-ring using the car's engine oil, or you can use silicone grease, which is what I'm going to use today. Okay, so we've got our oil filter on, and when you put your oil filter on, don't over tighten. I usually just bring them up till they contact and nip them a little bit, and the tightening torque on our oil drain plug is 50 Newton meters. Alright, so when you have the fluids out, for example, engine oil filler cap is right here in the back. You see I left the dipstick up and the oil cap is off. I do that so it reminds me that I don't have oil in the engine, but I want to drain the antifreeze right now. So I need to go ahead and take our antifreeze cap off as well to let air into the system. While I'm here, because I'm sick of this thing falling on my head, I'm just going to pop our hood struts off and put on our new strut so it'll hold the engine hood up without it falling on my head all the time. One, okay. Now the engine lid will stay up by itself and not fall on my head. So the coolant drain is right here on the bottom of the engine. You want to make sure the engine's nice and cold when you're doing this. And then I just use a 5-gallon bucket. And we'll let it drain out for a little while. Part of doing the major service on this car is we're changing the fuel filter. The connections for the fuel lines are just really plug and play. There's a little button. Press that button right there, and then the fitting will slide out. It will drip fuel. I've already changed this one so that the fuel filter is empty, but normally I'll have a container underneath it to catch my fuel. Then when you're plugging them back in, you just want to line them up, push them in till they click, just like that. On the fuel filter itself, there's one up on the center up in here. Same way, it's got a little push button that you push and it pulls off. There's also an electrical connection right here to the fuel filter. Now this is just a ground because you're flowing fuel and it's relatively insulated down here, connected on plastic brackets. They do this for static, so you want to make sure that that electrical connection, that grounding connection comes back on. When the fuel filter comes out, you'll have to undo this bolt and this bolt. Further back too, right here, you can see I've still got this coolant line unclipped. And these will come down, you can get this bracket out, and then you can spread these pipes and get the fuel filter out the front. And that's how you change the fuel filter. Okay, we're just going to put our foam air guide back in. So it's just going to fit up. There's a little bracket up in the top. You just kind of bend it down, get it up in around. Seals out pipes. Push my last coolant pipe up, and I'm just going to snap that up into place. So once you're all done and it's all put back together, it should be all sealed up just like that. So because I've got the water pump off of this car and the cooling system drained, and I don't know how long it's been since anyone's looked at this, the car did have some overheating issues. I want to go ahead and pop my thermostat out. The thermostat on these cars is all part of the housing, and it's a major deal to change later on down the track. It means completely redraining the cooling system again, so I figured I might as well just pull it out and replace it right now. They're not particularly expensive, and hopefully just dodge a bullet. So there's our thermostat assembly. You can buy these two ways. You can buy them with the entire housing, which is how Porsche sells them, or there is an aftermarket version that allows you to twist this out and change just the centerpiece. I usually like to change the whole housing, just because even though this one's in fairly reasonable shape, this housing can get all corroded up, so it's not a bad thing to do the whole thing. I've got my new water pump installed, and what I need to do now is put on a new belt. So I'm just removing the old belt first and sliding it out. Then when I put the new one on, I want to make sure that my writing is facing out so I can read it. And the reason I do that is these belts shouldn't be reversed. So it's a good habit to put your belts on all the same way, so if you have to take it off in service, it goes on the same way it came off. Then I'm just going to start wrapping it around the crank pulley to begin. Down the tensioner. Around that water pump. So typically the way I like to do it is have it all set on so it's on the pulleys. I've got it around my crank, AC, power steering, alternator, and water pump. And then I'm just not on the final idler roller. Using a 24mm wrench, I'm going to press the tensioner down. That's going to let the belt slide over the roller. Then I just need to let go of it. And that should lock it all in place. Except I've gone on the wrong side of the pulley. There we go. Okay. So you need to make sure that it was in the pulleys all the way. So I had a problem at first where I couldn't quite get it to snap over, and the issue was it had popped out of my power steering pump pulley up here, and my crank pulley had popped out. But now I'm nice and smooth all the way around. I've got good tension on the belt, and we should be ready to roll. One of the parts of our 100,000 mile service is changing our air filter, which is located right here. So when you've got the engine cover off, pull these, there's two clips, there's one under here, one right here, just going to pull them off. And then I'm going to pop this up with my thumbs and work that filter out like that. Okay, we have our new filter. Just going to slide that in. Make sure it locks down, and then just press it down with my thumbs. Slide that back in. Okay, you got to make sure the filter's all the way in, and then slide in the plastic piece, and that's what lifts the filter up, and make sure you hear it click and lock down on both sides. And we're in. Part of any major service is doing a leak down test, and a leak down test is going to tell us the condition of the engine, allow us to keep track of it. 100,000 miles is a good time to do that anyways. First thing I want to do is on my crank pulley, I have my TDC mark right here, and I also have a top dead center mark on the front of the pulley. Now, normally I would look at my ignition distributor to see if I was on cylinder 1 or cylinder 4. This one you got a 50-50 chance of it getting it right. So right now I've brought it up. You can put the pipe in, have somebody turn the engine over for you by hand and feel for air pressure. That's another way to confirm. But I'm on cylinder number 1, and this is going to be the same as the standard 911. Firing order is 162435. Cylinder 1 is here on the left. Goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's see what we've got on cylinder 1. I have already pulled the spark plugs out. To do that, fairly straightforward. There's 2 bolts, one on each coil. You unplug the coil wires, undo the 2 Allen head bolts, and then you pull the spark plugs out. Right now I have my tool in on cylinder 1, which is all the way up the front, and I've got my leak down tester sitting here. It's not installed yet, so if I reach up and I plug it in, wait for my gauge to stabilize, and it looks like we're right around 8 to 10%, which is fairly normal for a car of 100,000 miles. Once I've done cylinder 1, the next one on the firing order is number 6, and what I need to do is rotate my crankshaft over. So I've got my ratchet with a 24mm socket on my crank pulley. On these ones, they don't have the same marking setups as the 911s, so I've just got to kind of estimate my splits down here. We're going to end up with that pulley right around here, so I'm just going to use a hole to reference roughly where I'm at. Okay, so that should be pretty close. I'll check to make sure the cylinder's at the top. I'll just use a small screwdriver, slide it down the spark plug hole, and then do my cylinder leakage. So if I use a very small screwdriver, I can feel right here my piston is all the way up on the top. I'm going to screw in my leak down and put some air pressure in. Sitting right around 6%. Looks good. So I'm just going to continue on going from cylinder to cylinder and recording all of my numbers. I've finished doing the leak down. Our average leak down is around 8%. We had one cylinder, cylinder 4, that was at 10%, and the lowest cylinder was cylinder 6 at 6%. Now, all of these numbers are really good. On these engines, on average, you're usually going to be right between 5 and 10% for an engine that's in good condition, running well, and needs no further internal service. What I got to do now is put my spark plugs back in. So I've got my new plugs lined out on top of my coils. I washed my coils off as well because they were pretty nasty looking, covered in some oil from a slight valve cover leak. And the other thing that I want to do too is have a look down the center of my coil. Make sure there's no corrosion. There's a spring down there that contacts on the plug. And these ones all cleaned up fine, so I'm just going to go and put them back in. When I put the plugs back in, I'm going to use a little bit of copper grease, just because it's a steel on aluminum cylinder head. Even though Bosch now says with their thread designs that you don't have to, I still do. On the back two cylinders, so cylinders 3 and cylinders 2, I can come in just with my long extension, carefully slide it in, and I want to screw the plugs in by hand before I tighten them down. So I'll just get that in, grab my ratchet, and give that a quarter turn on the gasket once it contacts. Alright, already on this one I've got a slight difference, so I don't want to risk damaging the plug. So I'm going to add to my extension a wobble joint, and this allows my plug socket to move. Screw it in finger tight, knock it down. Then on the last one, because it's buried back in here, all the way past, you've got the O2 sensor plug right here. I've got to get it in here. I'm going to use a universal joint on my extension, so I can still use my long extension, but be able to reach in and get the spark plug in. Okay, it's in and tight. The procedure is exactly the same on the other side. The back two cylinders are going to be easy to get to. Front cylinder is going to be a little bit tougher, although on that side of the engine it's a little bit easier. Next, my coil packs go back in, and I'm just going to slide these in, and I want to feel them, make sure they engage on that plug. Take my Allen screws, So I started both Allen head bolts by hand, and then I'm just using a quarter drive wobbly 5mm Allen wrench socket to put them in and tighten them down. So I got two things going for me. One, it's a wobble extension. Two, it's a ball end on my Allen wrench. That way I can come in at oblique angles, especially getting the top bolts, because they're kind of obscured by the body, and tighten those two bolts down. Then plug my coil back in. You want to make sure you hear that little click, and that's it. I'll put the rest of the coils in, and that's going to finish this side of the service. I'm going to be changing the gear oil in this car, and to do that I got to get this tray off. I've already pulled all of my bolts and nuts out of it. On my rear trailing arms here, I didn't want to remove the entire arm because my rack pads are sitting on it, so I just punched my studs up to help me clear that out. So I should be able to slide this out, hopefully. If it doesn't. All right, so I did have to swing my one bar out of the way so I can get up in and access the transmission. So this is the drain plug on the transmission, and then around here on the side, this is our fill plug. Now it's a 17mm hex up in the fill plug, and this one is a 12-point tamper-proof. So when it comes to changing your transmission oil, it is best practice to always loosen the fill plug first. Nothing worse than draining your transmission oil and then figuring out that you can't get the fill plug out. On these transmissions, the oil level should be approximately 11mm below the height of the fill plug. You do not want to fill these till it comes running out. And normally you can use a little hook tool. I'm just going to use my finger to put it in and see if I can feel the oil level, which there's the oil. The oil that it takes is a 75W90 gear oil. It's a standard gear oil, but now I got the fill out, I can go ahead and drain it. To undo the drain plug, you want to use a triple square tamper-proof, and tamper-proof means it's got a hole drilled in the center of it because there's a post up in there on the drain plug. And these are a tapered plug, so I'm going to use a large bar and just crack it loose.
It looks great.
Yep. Looks pretty clean, actually. Doesn't smell awful. Smells like gear oil. You can see on that plug there's the tamper-proof. See the post in the center? So that stops you using a standard triple square. And this is an M16 is the size, so a metric 16 triple square. And we're just going to let that sit and drip for a while. And then let's just have a quick feel around in there. So I'd say that's pretty normal, actually pretty good for a transmission with 100,000 miles on it. No big crunchies up in there, no big black sludge. Okay, once the oil's all drained out, we've let this sit and drip for about 20 minutes. I'm going to put my plug back in. Then when it comes to tightening these are a tapered plug. So even though it's a large thread around an M22 thread, you don't want to tighten these too tight. The actual tightening torque is 25 Newton meters, which is only around 18 foot-pounds. So that's it. Not very tight in the scheme of things, but if you over tighten these, you'll damage the case and also make the plug much harder to get out. The last thing I'm doing is just cleaning all of the oil from draining because it'll kind of wick out around the plug. And we don't want the next guy to see it to think that there's an oil leak, so I'm cleaning off the oil around the plug. The last part of doing our transmission service is to re-oil it. So I am using a Swepco oil. and I have my little 1 gallon pump in my container, and then I'm connected up into our fill. Now with these, normally I would pump it up until I had oil dribbling out, but with these they want the oil level to be about 11 millimeters below the fill plug. So I'm going to pump and just keep an eye. I know roughly it's going to take about 2 quarts of oil, so I'm just going to kind of feel my oil container, and once I get close I'll stop. For me, if I take my finger, put it in the hole and push down, I should just be able to touch the oil on the very tip of my index finger. So let's go ahead and fill it. Now it's kind of chilly this morning in the shop, so the oil is kind of thick and it's going to take a little bit of time to pump it in there. I'm going to check my level. I've got roughly about 2 quarts in there. Just want to put my finger in, fold it down, and I can feel the oil level right there. And then when I bring it out, I've got the oil right on the tip of my finger. So we are good to go. And these are the same as the fill plug. They're a tapered plug. So I'm going to tighten it to 25 Newton meters, and that's it. And then I'll wash the area. So one of the things that we're doing as part of our major service and also a time situation is change our brake fluid. I've already sucked the old fluid out of the container at the front of the car and refilled it with fresh ATE.4 fluid. And now what I'm going to do is have somebody in the car to pump the brakes while I put on my little rubber hose right here and open this valve, and then what I'm going to do is have this fluid pumped through into my little container down there. That's going to push the old fluid through, bringing the new fluid into the brake caliper. Pump it through, so slowly press the brake pedal all the way to the ground and then slowly let it come up.
Again.
Keep going until I tell you to stop. Solid?
Yeah.
Okay, hold it to the ground. Okay, pump it up. Relax for a second. So what I've done is the first time where I'm having him pump the brake pedal is I'm just flushing the fluid out of the caliper. Then when I have him pump and hold it, I'm doing a final air check, making sure that no air bubbles are coming out. And I'm just using a standard hose that A, I can look and see that there's no air bubbles, and B, it stops it squirting all over the car. So when you're bleeding your brakes, you want to start on the right rear brake caliper. That's the furthest away from the brake master cylinder. Next wheel I'm going to go to is going to be the left rear, and then I'll come over to the right front, and finally the left front when I'm bleeding out the brakes. Don't forget to check your fluid because you are exhausting it. Okay, hold it down. Okay, pump it up. So once you've done bleeding all 4 wheels, you want to come here and make sure that your fluid level is right up to the maximum, which it is. Usually I just wiggle that master cylinder reservoir to make sure it is. You don't want to overfill it. You just want to keep it right there. Make sure the cap is on tight. The other thing to look for is there is a seal under there. Make sure the seal's there. Sometimes they can fall off while the cap's off. So make sure that's all on, and that wraps up bleeding the brakes. When it comes to brake fluid, you always want to use a new container of brake fluid. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs water. So if you have that old brake fluid container that you used like half of 5 years ago, the last time you did the job, you don't really want to do that, because sitting on the shelf, there's a high possibility that it's absorbed a bunch of moisture already, even with the cap on, and especially if you live somewhere in like the Northeast where you have a lot of high humidity. So the way I do it is I always use a full quart of brake fluid. I order a brand new one for each car, and I usually end up using the entire quart, which I did on this car. By the time you suck the reservoir out, flush the system through, it takes about that much anyway. So always want to use new unopened brake fluid. So part of doing the cooling system change is I did a pressure test on the cooling system using pressure gauge and an adapter to screw on. It's 15, 16 PSI. So I got the car back down on the ground and we're going to go test drive for the wheel alignment. It's also the first time that this car has seen the road in 4 years. So I kind of want to feel how other things are doing. It's got new tires, new brakes in the back, new shocks all the way around. So I suspect it should be pretty good, I'm hoping. But we'll find out in just a minute.